China's record trade surge sends shockwaves through global power politics. There was no emergency summit, no dramatic declaration, no official admission that the global balance of trade had quietly shifted beneath the surface of international politics. Yet, amid rising geopolitical tensions, renewed tariff threats, and intensifying economic rivalry, a single development has begun reshaping global power in ways few expected and even fewer openly acknowledge. China has recorded the largest trade surplus ever seen in modern economic history, nearly $1.2 trillion in a single year. This milestone did not emerge during a period of calm cooperation or expanding globalization. It occurred during a time defined by trade pressure, strategic decoupling efforts, and renewed confrontation with the United States. For years, the prevailing assumption in Washington and beyond was straightforward. Sustained economic pressure would weaken China's export engine. Tariffs would slow factories, shrink market access, and force policy concessions. Supply chains would relocate. Manufacturing would return home. Leverage would be restored. Instead, the opposite unfolded. China exported more goods than at any point in its history. Its trade surplus widened dramatically. Its dependence on the US market declined, and its economic reach expanded across regions once considered peripheral to global commerce. This is not merely an economic development, it is a geopolitical signal. Today, we examine how this happened, why traditional trade pressure failed to deliver expected outcomes, what this means for American strategy, and how the global trade system may be entering a new phase one where leverage, influence, and power operate very differently than before. A trade surplus approaching $1.2 trillion is not a routine data point. It represents a structural shift in the global economy. To put this figure into perspective, it exceeds the annual economic output of many developed nations. It reflects the cumulative difference between what China sold to the world and what it purchased in return, after accounting for currency movements, logistics constraints, and geopolitical friction across every major market. What makes this milestone particularly striking is its timing. This record surplus was achieved during a period of renewed tariff pressure, heightened political scrutiny, and deliberate efforts by Washington to reduce reliance on Chinese manufacturing. Conventional wisdom suggested such pressure would compress exports and weaken industrial output. Instead, Chinese exports surged. Outbound shipments reached historic levels, driven not by a single region but by broad-based expansion across Asia, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. While exports to the United States declined, growth elsewhere more than compensated. This shift was neither accidental nor reactive. Over the past several years, China systematically reduced reliance on any single export destination. Trade agreements were expanded, infrastructure corridors were reinforced, logistics networks were modernized, currency arrangements were adjusted to support diversification. The result was an export system far more resilient than many anticipated. Rather than slowing under pressure, Chinese manufacturers adapted. They rerouted supply chains, adjusted pricing strategies, localized production stages, and targeted emerging markets with growing demand. This exposed a fundamental miscalculation at the heart of trade pressure strategies. Pressure assumed dependence, and once autonomy is established, leverage weakens. Trade pressure was designed with specific objectives. First, reduce the bilateral trade imbalance. Second, force changes in industrial policy. Third, accelerate the return of manufacturing activity to domestic economies. Tariffs were the primary tool. By raising costs on imported goods, the theory held that demand would shift, suppliers would relocate, and exporters would be compelled to negotiate. On paper, the logic appeared sound. In practice, global trade does not operate in isolation. When tariffs increased the cost of Chinese goods entering the US market, exporters did not simply absorb losses. Buyers adjusted sourcing strategies. Sellers redirected shipments. Markets evolved. Most importantly, demand did not vanish, it relocated. At the same time, many American firms continue to rely on Chinese components deeply embedded within global supply chains. Even when final assembly moved to third countries, intermediate inputs often remained tied to Chinese production. This created a paradox. Visible trade declined in one channel, while hidden dependence persisted across others. Meanwhile, the assumption that reduced US ANS imports would cripple export growth failed to account for global demand trends. Emerging economies expanded consumption, infrastructure investment accelerated, industrialization continued. China positioned itself to meet that demand aggressively. Tariffs restricted one corridor, but the global system opened several others. The response was not confrontational, it was methodical. Chinese exporters intensified market diversification. Southeast Asia absorbed rising volumes. Africa and the Middle East increased imports of machinery, electronics, and industrial equipment. Europe, despite political debates, remained deeply integrated into supply chains. At the same time, China moved decisively up the value chain. Exports were no longer dominated by low-cost consumer goods. High-value products, electric vehicles, advanced electronics, renewable energy systems, and industrial machinery accounted for a growing share. This shift mattered for two reasons. First, higher value exports generate larger trade surpluses per unit. Second, they are significantly harder to replace. While some manufacturing migrated elsewhere, the ecosystem supporting advanced production remained concentrated. Skilled labor, supplier density, logistics efficiency, and scale continued to favor established networks. Currency dynamics also played a role. Exchange rate flexibility improved export competitiveness, while domestic policies cushioned firms facing external pressure. Crucially, escalation was avoided. Rather than responding with sweeping countermeasures, Beijing focused on maintaining production continuity and expanding access. The objective was insulation, not retaliation. This frustrated expectations. Trade pressure was intended to provoke confrontation. Instead, it produced adaptation, and adaptation compounds. Once exporters secure new markets, relationships deepen, contracts extend, infrastructure aligns. Reversing that shift becomes increasingly difficult. Temporary responses become structural changes. Trade leverage depends on dependency. For decades, access to the American consumer market was viewed as indispensable. Losing that access was assumed to be economically devastating. That assumption no longer holds. The global economy has diversified. Consumption growth is increasingly distributed. Infrastructure spending outside traditional centers has expanded rapidly. As a result, exclusion from one market no longer equates to isolation. Tariffs also impose costs on both sides of the transaction. Higher prices ripple through supply chains, affecting importers, manufacturers, and consumers. In many cases, companies absorb these costs rather than abandoning suppliers entirely. Others shifted assembly while retaining upstream sourcing. The result was complexity, not decoupling. Domestic manufacturing did not scale quickly enough to replace lost imports. Capacity takes time to build. Skills take years to develop. Supply chains do not materialize overnight. This left gaps that alternative suppliers filled, often still connected to Chinese inputs. Trade flows were redistributed, not reduced. Pressure lowered visibility, not influence. Economic data does not issue statements, but it communicates clearly. A record surplus achieved under pressure sends a message: resilience, not defiance, not confrontation. Resilience. It signals to partners that engagement remains viable. It signals to competitors that isolation is ineffective. It signals to neutral states that diversification offers stability. This is why the development matters geopolitically. Influence is not exercised solely through diplomacy or military power. It flows through trade routes, supply chains, and financial relationships. By sustaining export growth and expanding surplus, China reinforced its position within those networks. At the same time, the declining share of exports destined for the United States reflects a shift in relative leverage. This does not mean American influence has disappeared, but it does mean influence is now contested differently. Access is no longer binary, it is modular. Countries engage selectively, companies hedge exposure, markets pivot when pressured, blunt instruments lose effectiveness. The implications extend beyond two nations. Emerging economies observe that economic engagement no longer requires alignment. Trade partnerships can be pragmatic rather than ideological. Developed economies face a different challenge. Competitive advantage must be earned through innovation, productivity, and coordination, not assumed through pressure. Global trade is entering a phase where resilience matters more than dominance. Supply chains are becoming multidirectional. Power is becoming distributed. Leverage is becoming conditional. Rivalry persists, but its mechanics have changed. Economic influence now rewards flexibility. Looking ahead, several trajectories are possible. Trade pressure may intensify, negotiations may resume, new frameworks may emerge. But one reality is increasingly difficult to ignore. The global trade system is harder to control through unilateral action. Future strategies will emphasize partnerships, regional integration, and domestic competitiveness. For China, sustaining momentum will require innovation and careful market management. For the United States, restoring leverage will require predictability and collaboration. The era of simple pressure is fading. The era of complex competition has arrived. History does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears as a data point buried in economic tables. Sometimes it unfolds quietly while attention is focused elsewhere. A record trade surplus achieved under pressure is one such moment. It does not end rivalry, it reframes it. The global trade system is no longer anchored to a single center. It is increasingly networked, adaptive, and resistant to shock. Those who understand this will shape the next phase of economic power. Those who do not may find their influence gradually eroding. This was not a headline grabbing victory. It was something more consequential. It was a structural shift. What makes this moment especially significant is not simply the size of the surplus, but what it reveals about how global power now functions. For much of the post-Cold War era, economic influence was exercised through control of access. Markets were gates, routes were choke points, financial systems were levers. If a major economy restricted entry, the assumption was that pressure would cascade outward, forcing compliance. That model is weakening. The record surplus achieved under pressure demonstrates that modern trade power no longer depends on a single gatekeeper. It depends on networks distributed, redundant, and adaptive. And networks behave very differently under stress. When access to one market narrows, exporters do not necessarily retreat, they reroute. When one financial channel tightens, alternatives emerge. When one supply chain fractures, parallel systems compensate. This is the environment in which China's export system operated and thrived. The decline in the share of exports going to the United States is often framed as a loss. In isolation, it might appear that way. But viewed structurally, it represents a rebalancing of exposure. Reduced concentration lowers vulnerability. It transforms dependence into optionality. Optionality is power. It allows exporters to negotiate from strength, not desperation. It allows policymakers to absorb pressure without immediate concession, and it allows economic relationships to persist even amid political tension. This shift has implications far beyond China and the United States. Emerging economies are watching closely. Many have long faced a dilemma: engage economically while risking political alignment, or disengage and forgo growth. The recent trade data suggests a third path is possible: pragmatic engagement without exclusivity. Trade can flow without allegiance. For countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, this is not an abstract theory. It is a lived reality. Infrastructure projects, industrial investment, and manufacturing capacity have expanded rapidly in these regions. Demand has grown. And suppliers who can deliver at scale, speed, and price have gained influence. China positioned itself to meet that demand consistently. This does not mean alternatives do not exist. Other producers are expanding, regional manufacturing hubs are emerging, but the pace of replacement matters. And here, time becomes a strategic variable. Building industrial ecosystems takes years. Developing supplier depth takes decades. Training skilled labor, integrating logistics, and achieving scale are not instant processes. During that transition, demand still needs to be met. That gap has favored incumbents. This is why trade flows were redistributed rather than reduced. Goods still moved, value still accumulated, influence still circulated, often along newly reinforced routes. Tariffs raised costs, but they did not erase comparative advantages. In many cases, they merely reshaped them. Meanwhile, domestic manufacturing revival faced structural constraints. Capacity expansion requires sustained investment. Workforce development requires long-term planning, and political cycles often move faster than industrial transformation. The result was a mismatch between ambition and execution. Companies adapted pragmatically. Some shifted final assembly, others diversified sourcing. Many absorbed higher costs, but few exited entirely. Hidden dependencies persisted beneath visible changes. This complexity diluted the effectiveness of pressure, and diluted pressure produces unintended outcomes. As exporters adapt, they innovate. As markets diversify, resilience increases. As networks expand, exclusion becomes harder. The global trade system becomes less hierarchical and more modular. Influence becomes conditional rather than absolute. This is the context in which the record surplus must be understood. It is not a declaration of dominance. It is evidence of adaptation within a fragmented system. And adaptation, once achieved, is difficult to reverse. Geopolitical consequences are subtle but profound. Economic leverage no longer guarantees policy outcomes. Pressure no longer ensures compliance, and rivalry no longer follows predictable lines. Instead, competition shifts towards standards, technology, productivity, and coordination. High value exports illustrate this shift clearly. Electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, advanced electronics, and industrial machinery are not easily substituted. They require ecosystems, research, manufacturing, supply chains, and after sales support working in concert. Once those ecosystems are established, displacement becomes expensive and slow. This is why moving up the value chain matters strategically. It transforms trade from volume-based competition to system-based competition. System-based competition favors scale, integration, and endurance. It also raises the stakes. As more countries depend on complex imports rather than simple goods, economic relationships deepen. Interdependence grows, and disentanglement becomes costly for all parties. This does not eliminate rivalry, it reframes it. Power becomes less about denying access and more about shaping environments, less about exclusion and more about influence within shared systems. This challenges traditional assumptions about control. For the United States, it raises strategic questions. If pressure alone no longer delivers outcomes, what does leverage look like? How can influence be exercised in a networked economy? The answer likely lies in coordination rather than confrontation, in alliances rather than unilateral action, in competitiveness rather than restriction. Domestic strength becomes central. Innovation, infrastructure, workforce development, and policy stability matter more than tariffs alone. For China, sustaining momentum is not guaranteed. Adaptation must continue. Innovation must accelerate. Markets must be managed carefully. Overcapacity risks must be addressed. Resilience is not permanence. It requires constant adjustment. But the lesson of the surplus is clear. Pressure without coordination breeds adaptation, not capitulation. This reality is reshaping how countries think about economic power. Trade is no longer just an exchange of goods. It is a platform for influence, a channel for standards, a mechanism for shaping future growth. Those who understand this are repositioning themselves quietly. History often moves this way, not with announcements, but with numbers. Not with declarations, but with data. Not with visible confrontation, but with gradual realignment. A $1.2 trillion surplus achieved under pressure is such a signal. It does not end competition, it changes its terrain. The global trade system is no longer anchored to a single center of gravity. It is increasingly distributed, resilient, and adaptive. Influence now flows through networks rather than choke points. And in this environment, power belongs not to those who apply the most pressure, but to those who adapt fastest. This was not a loud victory. It was a quiet transformation, and its consequences are only beginning to unfold.